Now let's move to the core of the event, and I want to introduce you our senior medical officer. I don't think we need to introduce more. Many of you know Ansgar Eichler to chair and to present the rest of the event. Ansgar, please.
Thank you, Guido. Good morning again. You have heard from Guido that on this birthday, we will not look backwards and celebrate, but we look forward. We want to continue to evolve. We want to continue to learn. But we are aware, as they say, you ain't learn nothing while you're talking. So we want to listen what our stakeholders have to say, what they expect from us over the next years. And we thought best to kick off this discussion by hearing from two very prominent representatives of two key stakeholders. And I will start with a prominent representative from our regulated industry. So what does the research-based pharmaceutical industry think of us? What do you in future expect from us? And I have the pleasure to introduce a very prominent speaker, as I said. Dr. Elias Zerhouni is the president of Global Research and Development and a member of the executive committee for Sanofi. So Sanofi is one of our big, call it customer or clients. Before he got into that position, he had a very impressive career too, and I will only point out that he was director of the NIH in the US from 2002 to 2008, which is arguably the most influential position in health research on the planet. In November 2009, US President Obama appointed Elias as one of the first presidential US science envoys. And he had many other important career steps. A year ago, Elias published a widely quoted article, an essay, the title of which was Turning the Titanic. And the Titanic referred to the biopharmaceutical R&D. So Elias, we'd like to hear from you. If you are the Titanic, what is the EMA's role? Are we passengers on your ship, or are we the iceberg? Over to you.
That's a great way to start. First of all, let me tell you, you're on the ship. You're not a passenger. You're a co-captain. Because, frankly, if we don't steer in the same direction, we will hit the iceberg. And the iceberg, to me, frankly, is the mountain of the disease burden that is affecting the world. And in particular, one that I will talk about in my talk is the rising burden of chronic diseases, their impact on healthcare systems, and the fundamental question that I have, is our Titanic, with you as a co-captain, really handling the challenges of being able to develop therapies for diseases that affect millions, where we're only seeing the emerged tip of the iceberg, where diseases that are chronic, where in fact most of the disease is submerged before it becomes clinically apparent. And therefore, this is something that I think is a fitting beginning to this talk. First, let me say that from my perspective, I was in academia. I was at Johns Hopkins, and I was heading research and in the medical school. And then I was in government. Now I'm in industry. And what I can say is I can echo what Guido Rossi said. Complexity is really facing us. A level of complexity that we as scientists did not imagine 20 years ago. And in fact, we have made enormous progress in unraveling the complexity of biology. But I would tell you that we are far behind in understanding the complexity of human disease biology. And this is what the translational gap that we are facing, that we are challenged with, is going to be the challenge for all of us to meet. The other conclusion I drew is that no single institution, academic, government, industry, any kind of institution, any country, any continent has all it needs to have to overcome this complexity. And so I think the order of the day is going to be intense collaboration over confrontation. And I think this is truly what I think the EMA has shown. And I really wanted to be here, and I want to thank you for your invitation both Guido and Hans-Jörg to be here, because I think it is what I think EMA has done in many ways. You know, you've passed your teenage years now, happy birthday, like we say, but in fact, you have done for Europe what we wish to be done for the world. And I think it's important to really follow that and focus fundamentally on issues that, to me, are going to be very significant going forward. And I don't want to cover the waterfront because I saw the documents, I saw also the speakers. I was so honored to follow Peggy, a great leader of American science, medicine, and health, and precede Mark Warport, same in the UK. So I'm in the middle of the sandwich there. So what do I say? What I want to say is really focus on three things. No question, and I follow Peggy's leadership on this, we need to work on regulatory science, and I will cover some of those aspects from the innovator point of view. Then the second is we as innovators have to make decisions and investments that are increasingly large, and we need to make them in a world that is increasingly either convergent in some areas and divergent in other areas. Divergence in policies, divergence in synchronization, which makes, in fact, the investment more and more difficult to do for addressing major diseases. And this leads investment boards to make decisions which I deplore personally, which is the trend today to go to more narrow, more orphan, more specialty drugs at the expense of primary care drugs. And in fact, if you look at the WHO projections, my thesis is that this is going towards the iceberg. We're going in the wrong direction, because at the end of the day, the diseases where I see approvals coming affect less than 20% of the population. And 80% is not affected, and we have issues there which are driving investments, which I just wanted to share with you and to find collaborative ways of addressing these intended and unintended consequences on public health. So these are my three topics. I'd like to go through them. I think EMA is an example of partnership. I would say that the openness of the agency over the years, the scientific content, I mean, we constantly see interactions with the leaders of the agency, within the R&D community in the industry, as well as the R&D community in the governments that we face across the world, is really an example to follow. I mean, I have to say, I was very impressed with the ability to work hand in hand and have profound discussions. And the quality of the discussions I'm having with the members of the experts at the EMA are amazingly thorough and thoughtful. And then, obviously, we need to ensure that biomedical research, this is turning the Titanic towards where we need to make more progress, faster, because at the end of the day, governments are really impacted by our inability to provide systemic therapies that will systemically change the system. You see what I mean? It's important that we do that, and it's important that we address what is 80% of healthcare costs today, as opposed to the 20% that we're addressing. So you've been leading the way. I don't want to go through that. And what has Pharma done? Pharma operates very differently today. How? The large internal research efforts of the typical Titanic-like R&D organization, which was a closed organization with what I call the corporate R&D model of the past. Industries were like this in the 40s and the 50s. Every large company had its own R&D laboratories, and they were closed. And that has disappeared in every industry except the pharmaceutical industry. And it's disappearing fast because we realized, because of the complexity that Guido was mentioning, because of the difficulty to have multidisciplinary inputs to solve a fundamental translational scientific problem, for which half of the knowledge is not there, requires interactions with biotechs, with universities, with foundations, with other pharmaceutical companies, and we need to have this done actively and seeking partnerships, public and private, like the IMI or the AMP in the US with NIH, because we need a much larger common ground of knowledge, Whether it be in predictive toxicology or epidemiology, we need to share really data at a greater extent, to a greater extent and publicly worldwide, so that the level of knowledge increases across the board. So the notion of siloed R&D is something that I personally believe has no future. You need networked innovation to succeed. And this really relates to the Uberification of R&D. In other words, when you have Uber and you call a cab, you call the best cab available, the closest place possible, right? That's what you do. You don't say, well, let me call headquarters and the other country, make sure that things come up in 2 months. And that's not how you work in the real world. You want to disintermediate research and development. And that will have an impact on how you interact, because you can be, as I said, steering in the same direction or actually preventing this sort of Uberification of R&D. And I am pretty much certain that if you look at the complexity of an R&D project, an R&D initiative, you realize that it involves hundreds of people. And if one piece of it is weak, the whole enterprise fails. It's more complex than sending a rocket to the moon. I mean, you have to have everything work. Well, no company has that capability. I do not know of any entity in the world that has that capability. So the flexibility of connecting and disconnecting fast is really what we're going for. And I said again, scientific advances in modalities and technologies are very rapid, and they're really hampered by lack of human disease biology. The best example I can give you is the difficulty we have in identifying strategies for biomarkers. Whether surrogate endpoints or clinical endpoints, we all are facing a huge issue, and I don't know how to solve it, but I know that our common wisdom will allow us to solve it. So I think things will change. I mean, if there's one thing I can say is that the face of R&D for you, regulators, is going to be completely different as you go forward, both in the transparency, in the preclinical commons, in the epidemiological, genomics. I think people are going to share, as well as in the new technologies. And this is where I think the need for regulatory science is going to be greater. Now, it's not like for lack of investments that we're not solving the burden of disease that is affecting people, whether it be Ebola, for example, or diabetes. We're not changing the course of the disease. We're slowing it down, we're controlling it, but at the end of the day, disease-modifying and disease-preemptive solutions will have to be developed. Otherwise, we fail. And so the industry is, you are regulating the industry that invests the most in R&D. And it has invested even more so over the past few years with an exponential growth. If you look at the blue mountain there, that's the total R&D investment. And this is not well known to everybody, but the dotted line is what are the approvals. But more important than the number of approvals is what kind of approvals affecting what type of patients and what populations. And this is one question I have, and I always ask my colleagues, I say, tell me in the 70s, the things that were approved affected what percentage of the population, and tell me today, with 45, 50 approvals, what is it that is affecting what population, right? And we've made great progress in orphan drugs and rare diseases, and that was welcome and it's necessary. But is it all we need to do? That's the question I pose to the group here. So, strong regulatory science, I'm stealing actually from Peggy here. I've been one of her biggest fans, she knows, because I think she's right. Not only applying scientific methods to regulation, but really using research to discover new ways of regulating, new ways of doing what we need to do. And really it's almost like a creative engine, not just an application engine that I'm talking about. Because if you don't keep pace, if we don't keep pace, then we will slow things down and we will not move the Titanic as fast as we can. But if the regulatory science lags behind, it will definitely be a negative. So we need to really be active and understand that. If there is no clear development pathway to the patient, trust me, I have been so frustrated as the head of R&D when you go to the investment board of your company, that's the #1 question they ask you. How fast? How expensive? What are we going to do? Is there a clear way? And you know, the first thing they ask is, what does the FDA say? What does the EMA say? What does the PMDA say? What does, you know, you have a huge impact on our choices of investments. You do. And that, I think, is a responsibility that cannot be shied away from. Because at the end of the day, when I say, we have an idea about really stopping diabetes, people say, well, how long? Well, we have to intervene very early. Oh, here in the pre-diabetic patient. Oh, well, okay, how long is that trial going to be? 14 years. No way. Because if you do that in a chronic disease, you have no patent life left. And so what happens? We want short, focused, clear regulatory pathways to be able to take the risk. So that is a fundamental issue I want to share with you, which is a problem for me, because we're moving towards specialty care. I had a trouble, convincing my organization to fund the dengue vaccine when the first decision I made. Why is that? Because again, you have 45,000 patient trial. It's a huge endeavor. And at the same time, it is a very high-risk investment. And so what I'm trying to say here to you and plead with you is look at the total system. Don't look just at one piece of the system. The system is synergistic or antagonistic, depending on what we do in each node of the system. And investment decisions, and I know EMA is very sensitive to that, investment decisions are driven, are influenced by what you will do. So is this good for public health, really, to shift the investments away from primary care therapies? I don't know. So let me just say that you will drive innovation. I will not go into the details because all of you have understood, and I see through your documents, the work that you're doing in nanomedicine, the work that EMA with FDA, with other agencies are doing on biosimilars, for example. I mean, you really are tackling the issue of comparability of complex macromolecules and the reform that needs to match the pace and trajectory of scientific innovation I can see happening. There are pilots that are innovative and other, other sort of positive energy that I didn't see 10, 15 years ago, really, frankly. So the key to this is going to be manpower. So we can talk about all we want organizationally. I was leading the NIH with a $30 billion budget. But you know, you're only as good as the people you have and how trained they are, how committed they are to their mission. And as Peggy said, I was really surprised to see the lack of investment in regulatory science training programs, in doctorates in regulatory science, in public health schools having programs of regulatory science. And this is why I think, under Peggy's leadership and all of us, we said, let's have the Institute of Medicine really study this issue. And what you find is actually a huge gap. You become a regulator without truly having had the opportunity to do research in regulation, to do science in regulation. How can you motivate somebody with creativity who really believes that their future is to guarantee the safety and efficacy of drugs and the discovery and development of modern therapies? How do you stimulate them if they don't have a recognition mechanism within academia, within government, within industry? So this, to me, is a fundamental issue that I want to leave you with. How can we help is really my message. How can we work together to make this happen? IMI is a terrific opportunity for EMA to come up with ideas, and I'll be the most supportive to say, how do we do this in Europe? I know Peggy has created 4 centers in the US, and we in Pharma, I'm the head of the scientific committee, have decided to support the fellowship programs that she has, so that we can, in fact, find and encourage a next generation of highly trained scientists who would dedicate their life to regulatory science research. So, biomarkers, I am just not going to spend much time on this. So I don't want to cover the details. You understand, biomarkers are only as good as your understanding of the fundamental underlying biology. Let's not forget that. And we cannot stop the effort. We've made a lot of efforts. I mean, several drugs would not have been developed unless it had been done with biomarkers, A1C hemoglobin or the CD4 counts in HIVs, and there has been a lot of biomarker progress. The problem is science is lagging behind, and that is where we need, the Mark Warports of the world and the Francis Collins of the world to really focus on this issue of biomarker science. Companion diagnostics fall in the same category. There is a huge trend right now towards precision medicine, of stratifying the patient population, identifying who would benefit the most is key to payers, key to us, key to the medical and healthcare system. How do you do this better is going to be a real issue, and we're not there yet. For the same reasons biomarkers also suffering. I really salute the efforts of the MEA to look at adaptive clinical trial designs. FDA also is trying, especially in the cancer field, but we need to do better. We need to understand that the tools we have today allow us to dream of different approaches, which we couldn't do 20 years ago. Whether it be information system, the ability to track in information system evolutions of data, all of that is going to be key. And I think the key to all complex systems is like what evolution does. Evolution experiments and mutates and selects the best. There is no way that a group of experts can sit down today and, in my view, identify and define the best perfect system to help us adaptively develop what the best regulatory pathways would be for the very difficult diseases we're dealing with, right? What's the evolutionary way? Try an experiment. You know, what they always say is, if you do not know, design an experiment. That's the scientific method. And I think in here, I think the EMA's willingness to have the pilots, to me, is a breath of fresh air. I think this has the potential to reverse the trend away from primary care therapies for chronic disease. I think people will take stock of this and might change the attitudes of the R&D innovator enterprise, if you will. Working together, real-world data is really game-changing. And it's game-changing at a fundamental level for me. Because we didn't have the ability to record data over the centuries, we then resorted to statistical sampling. And you did this in industry, you did this in epidemiology. You had to do it. But sampling introduced enormous bias potential. And it doesn't really reflect the reality of the patient over time, during the life cycle of their disease. I think big data allows us not only to accumulate new knowledge, but to actually reduce variability, which is an indicator of quality. So to me, that's the big data requires a change in mindset. It's not just a new toy or capability. It does require us to have, again, research on regulatory science, validation experiments, to really do this, because big data can also turn to a big buzz with no content. So we have to be very careful about what it means. So benefit risk assessment, I think you heard this, the patient-centric approach to this, the ability for us to rigorously accumulate risk-benefit data, the Sentinel system at the FDA, our ability for us to establish a similar system in Europe. Over time, it will converge, no question. We will have to do ongoing risk-benefit assessment and stratify the risk-benefit assessment just like we're stratifying R&D decisions towards the patient populations most likely to benefit. It does change the equation. But we have to have a doctrine of risk-benefit assessment, which we do not have in our world. EPA has millions of parts per millions, and others have clear indicators of risk-benefit. We have a very variable sense of what risk-benefit is in biomedical research, for good reasons. A child is not an adult is not a pregnant patient. So those are things we need to have progress made. Clinical trial transparency is something that the EMA has led the way. Has been, a little bit confrontational, I would say, at some point. But to me, I completely agree that this is the right thing to do. But what is the lesson that we should take from this? there are issues. Everybody has a point of view about the value of their data. Commercial confidential information was clearly something we were concerned about. And we wanted to convey that. We did. AFP played its role. But at the end of the day, what to me it shows that we do not have a system of earlier understanding of each other's goals. We're not communicating well enough. And I think somehow, somewhere, these issues should really be discussed, way ahead of time. I mean, this is not an issue that happened overnight. It happened years ago, but people were saying, like the ostrich does in Australia, let me put my head in the sand and let's see if the storm will pass. We can no longer do that in the future. So I would say we need to discover ways to have an open, transparent dialogue about these issues way ahead of a forced policy decisions, which is never perfect. But in this case, I think we've made progress, and everybody is, in my view, going to be served. Now, the last the point I wanted to make is the point of regulatory convergence or divergence. So there is a view of the world that says that now we're a global world. We have global supply chains, global science, that the principles of science are the same, that in fact we are exchanging information like never before. You heard the discussions between EMA and FDA. I know PMDA, Dr. Kondo, is also very open to that exchange. I know that around the world, there are more opportunities to communicate, to exchange, to inform each other. You would believe and you would think that this would lead to regulatory convergence. Unfortunately, I think it's not leading there for good reasons. And we need to take ourselves to task about what can we do, because it does impose an enormous cost on the innovator. I spend 20% of our R&D budget trying to match and mix and match what I need to do to basically do the convergence between different systems. And so it gets very confusing, but pharmaceutical companies are global. We're not going to develop drugs just for one population. It doesn't make sense. You can't really recover the innovation that way. And so R&D to me is no longer national. I think I've made the point. It's global in nature. I think there are increasing regulatory differences across regions, not just in types, but in synchrony, for example. I'll give you an example. I have a phase 3 trial today. We applied at the same time in multiple countries, and there's a country, I won't name, that still hasn't given us the okay. We're going to finish the trial, and yet we're regulatory obligated to have a cohort of patients done in that country. So the synchrony is a problem. Differences in legislation, sovereign rights, obviously, I completely understand that. And the implementation of regulations, the social political systems, the politics of that are clear issues. But, and at the end of the day, you ask yourself, same science, same data, same outstanding regulatory agencies. Comparative analysis shows that 50% of labels between FDA and EMA are not the same. For same evidence. Then when you look at discordant decision, you see 22% of the cases are discordant in decision making. Why is that? And to me, as a scientist, that's where the nugget of truth is going to be. Because variance is an indicator of quality. So to me, variability in decision making tells us something that we need to look at and maybe evaluate and maybe improve over time. Why is that? The significant differences in timing is what I just mentioned, and that impacts the cost of doing trials, and really it's an opportunity cost. So I'm not even a teenager in industry. I'm 5 years old in industry. I've been there 5 years today. I can tell you, I reviewed all of the regulatory decisions in my short career. I can tell you today, there's not a single one that was fully consistent across regulatory agencies. That's the innovator's message. We need to do better because it does really move away resources from proper utilization of resources, of investments. So if you look at the two, 61% were approved by both agencies, 17% were refused by both, but you can see 6 and 16% where it was approved by EMA only, but not FDA, and 6% approved by FDA, but not EMA. And we need to really understand that. Now, timing. This is a graph that shows the time it takes for approvals. The red dot, if you will follow it over the years, you see very consistent time to approval. EMA is the first one, FDA a little faster than EMA, but the decisions are what they are. You see PMDA, a tremendous change over the past few years. Look at the beginning of the decade, and look there in terms of speed of decision making, they've caught up with the FDA. Same thing in Health Canada. And we're looking at this because it's important for our decision-making process to see which agency has the ability to match the development process. Like if you template the EMA and the FDA process, which I have done, what you find is that there is actually more transparency in my view, and I don't want to offend Peggy, in the EMA process. I favor personally the EMA process because I see there are specific dates at which exchange of information and opinion is mandated. There are two rapporteur and co-rapporteurs, so there is a balance of opinion. There's a check and balance in the system, which I really, as a scientist, appreciate. But there are these stop clocks and these very rigid systems. Whereas if you look at the FDA, the process is shorter, faster, but I think it's not as clearly spelled out in terms of what is the information we need to provide, so not to be surprised. I was at an AdCom just day before the AdCom, I get an enormously negative report with no warning. And I'm not complaining, I'm saying that this is the reality of the innovator, all right? So I'm not comparing, I think there are benefits to each. I think there's tremendous heterogeneity in some areas. Cancer at the FDA is done in an outstandingly positive way. The fact that FDA is willing to look at priority reviews and breakthrough designation has been a sea change in the ability for the innovator to make progress. So just the variability, the variation is an indicator of global quality. That's all I'm trying to say here. So you can see, for example, EMA, the red is the expedited or faster reviews, and you can see that the proportion by year of expedited review is quite significant at the FDA as opposed to the EMA. Also, PMDA, the red dots, the red bar show that here. And you can see across agencies what is the propensity of the agency to take responsibility and say, this is something the public needs and needs quickly, and I'm going to give it breakthrough priority designation. That's what the FDA does well. I don't think the MEA is in the same mode of action for reasons that I think are valid. I see Hans-Jörg is looking at me like, I'm going to throw you out of the Titanic, but forgive me for being candid. I think that's what you asked me to do. So I think regulatory harmonization at a national level is a good thing. At the European level, it's been a great thing. I think the cluster meetings are great, but let me just pose for you the following question. Imagine that aviation was regulated the way medicines are regulated. Imagine that when you took off from London, you had a radar frequency completely different than that of New York. And oh, by the way, the regulation says you can only have 200 passenger planes, and therefore, when you get to the US, where there's only 100 passenger plane, you have to disembark and take 2 planes. And then you go there to California, and oh, by the way, to go across the Atlantic, you can only do this in a super jumbo jet. And oh, by the way, you cannot do this with bags that are this size versus that size. What kind of world would we be in? What kind of world would that be? Don't you think we need, as a community, to think about the fact that we are dealing with a global industry, a global supply chain, and address the problem? So this is, I know Peggy thought about a World Regulatory Authority and is doing work in that regard. I applaud that. I think, we need to find a way, maybe at the G8, the G20, because I believe that this is a political decision. The fact that there was leadership in Europe to create the European Union at the political level in the 60s is what led the EMA to its success. And that needs to happen worldwide. I have already said what I had to say about the impact that we unintentionally are having on investment decisions that will affect health 10, 15 years from now is something that I wanted to bring up. This is not something I hear being mentioned, but this is a perspective. I think we need to reverse the trend away from primary care drugs towards specialty disease drugs that affect a smaller and smaller number of people at the expense of a larger and larger number of people and their costs that are the main drivers of failures of healthcare systems around the world. So I really thank you for having been invited, and I hope I haven't offended you too much, but I thought that it was what I was asked to do. Thank you very much.
Elias, thank you for a fantastic performance. If you listened carefully, you could hear he threw some roses, but at the same time there were a few thorns in between there. And that was exactly what we were hoping for. So we look forward to discussing some of these points that you raised.